Greetings, traveler. Often in game design, we have to attach stats to specific items to be able to use them in the game. But how do you come up with stats? How do you know which ones are important and which ones you don't need? This is a question that has been in my mind ever since I started doing game design altogether. And after I discovered this super easy framework for figuring out the stats, naming them, attaching values to them, and so on, I had the easiest time coming up with as many stats as possible for as many items as possible in the game. And today I want to share that framework with you. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 14 years now. And I remember the first time somebody asked me to attach stats to a human character in the game. I was completely stumped. I had been seeing stats in games for all my life essentially, and whether it's a character or an item or a weapon or whatever, it's very natural to see its stats, its abilities somewhere in the game UI. But when I had to do it, my mind was completely blank. I had never done it before. I just didn't know what you need, what you don't need, what makes a good parameter, and so on. So that's when I started going deeper into what our game had at the time, what other items in the game had, what other areas in the game were using for parameters. And I started researching, well, what do you need exactly? What stats are there that you absolutely need for an item, or a character or a weapon or anything else you might have in the game? And which ones are the ones that, they're nice to have, but they're not really necessary, or that you see in the game, but you don't know if the players are going to use them. And as I was going through this process of researching other games, seeing what they do, and then basically just philosophizing about what we need and what we don't, I came up with this question over and over and over again. So what makes a good, let's say, sword to the player? And the reason why I kept coming up with this question is because in so many games I was seeing parameters in items and weapons and so on, but I noticed that I only cared about very, very few of the parameters that I was seeing. So maybe let's take a sword as an example. Let's say a game has lots of swords in it and the swords have parameters, and one of the parameters is who is the maker of the sword. Now, if that is vital information for me choosing to use a sword or try to obtain it, then that is a good parameter. If it's a parameter that I just skim over and I don't care, so it doesn't matter who the maker was or the previous owner was, like it's not relevant to my gameplay, then this was a parameter I would skip. And I decided that there's some parameters that are absolutely necessary and there's others that are just nice to have. So today, let's talk about these absolutely necessary parameters, how to identify them, how to set them, how much of it we need for each one of them, and what is the thought process in this super easy framework that we need to go through to decide exactly the parameters that we need to get started with attaching stats to items. So for this example, let's take swords, since they're a very common item in games. And simply, when we try to think of what parameters we need for this item, it is very tempting to just copy other games. So hear me out on this one. When we say, especially swords, since they're a super common item, when we start thinking about their parameters, it's very normal to say, okay, attack power, speed, all the things that we've seen in other games. But I found that the more I fell into this mindset of just copying what other games do, the more it hurt my game design down the line, because I would inherit things from other games that didn't make sense in my game. So even though it's a good starting place, perhaps you can get reference from other games, see what they're doing, and get a first idea about what's relevant to your game. Eventually, you have to come up to this question: what makes a good sword to the player? And by that I mean, when the player sees a list of swords and he decides which one to purchase, which one to use next, which one he wants to go after as a reward from a monster that's out there or from a quest that's out there or something, when the player looks at this list, which are the stats he will absolutely need to reference to figure out if this sword is going to be an upgrade for him. So when you think about things this way, it really focuses your mind on what's absolutely necessary and what's good for flavor or as a description. And to be fair, that's not to say that you only should include the necessary stats in your game and never include anything else, right? Of course, you're free to do as you want, and other parameters might become relevant in other areas of the game. But before we get to those, let's put down the necessary ones. So when we ask this question, what makes a good sword to the player? We want to think about, well, when the player actually gets to use the sword, what will define if it will perform better than what he already has? Usually this comes in the terms of damage or ease of use or the extra abilities it has. And that is what we want to keep in mind. So that short list, those like 3-4 parameters that the player thinks through, that okay, this sword looks weaker but it can attack much faster, so overall I should be seeing an increase in damage. That evaluation is what should be at the core of our decision making. So when we ask what makes a good sword to the player, immediately we should have in our mind that scenario where the player already has a sword, he's looking at all these other options and he's evaluating. Do I go for this other option or do I keep the one I have? Or is one of these other options good for a particular situation in the game? So in this example, and this is just an example, of course you can take this into any direction that's relevant in your game. So in this example, I make the decision to include these parameters. So let's run through them and see why we chose each one of them. So in this case, I say that a sword, well, before actually we jump to this, let's talk about the approach we take to this game. We take a more realistic approach, a more closer to reality approach than a more cartoony one or a more light-hearted one or a more early gaming one. So in this game we want to express a bit more realism when it comes to swords and their parameters, I suppose. So with that viewpoint in mind, we say that one of the things that's definitely important for swords is sharpness, right? A blunt sword, in this case, in this game, is not very good for us. So sharpness is definitely going to be one of them. Another one is going to be durability. So if we use a sword and it breaks after 2 hits, obviously that's not good for us. Or perhaps we found a sword and it's very sharp, but the blade is so brittle that if we attack a stone target or a metal target, it's going to break immediately. This is something we definitely want to know before we choose to obtain this weapon. Another thing is type. So perhaps in our game we have many classes, perhaps types of weapons come with their own parameters, perhaps the player has to specialize in a certain type of sword in order to get the most out of it. And this is the kind of game we're talking about here in our example. So knowing the type of the sword is very important, because even if this is a great sword to use, if it doesn't match the type that the player has specialized in, of course the player won't be able to use all the bonuses he has stacked up with this type of weapon. And finally, the weight. So the weight can be interesting in multiple ways. In most games it's important because you want to know if it's light enough to be carried in your inventory on top of everything else that you're already carrying. So that's one reason why we need to know in this case. The other reason is because in this game we want to make a point very consciously that a heavy sword might be very sharp, very powerful and so on, but of course it's going to be slower to handle. So we want to make a point out of lighter swords being more nimble, being more easy to use, being faster and so on. So that's why in this case we choose to use weight as one of the core parameters, one of the core stats for the sword. Again, do we have to use these parameters? Absolutely not. It's up to us to decide what we want to use. But this is a very conscious design decision, and this is how I think through it. So when we have all these parameters, how do we attach values to them next? what's a good value? Why wouldn't we go with a 1 and a 2 for everything and call it a day? Of course we can, if it matches the type of game that we're making. But there's a few tricks that we can do with numbers that can communicate a lot without us having to say anything in terms of explanations. So in many games you see attack power, for example, 17, and you think, well, what does that 17 mean? Is it 17 damage? Is it 17 out of 100? Is it something else? It can be very mysterious. So if we can communicate the value of the parameter just with the numbers, it does so much for making our job easier, for communicating to the player if this stat is important and how good this item does in this particular stat, without us having to word by word explain everything about every single parameter. So there's many number systems. I've made a video before about what story numbers tell, so I'm gonna leave a link to the description for that one if you want to check it out. But to keep it simple, in this case we're gonna take a system from 1 to 100. Why from 1 to 100 and not 1 to 50 or 1 to 5 billion? That's because in many parts of society we use percentages for completeness or quality. So if you say that something is 100% complete, then you say it's complete. Or if you say that something scores 100 points out of 100, you think, well, it's perfect then. So because humans have this framework in their mind already, we can use that framework to attach a value to a parameter we just came up with. And when we do that, when we communicate to the player that right now we're ranking things from 0 to 100, we're communicating two things: that 100 is perfect and 0 or 1 is the minimum score. And also, by choosing to go from 1 to 100 and not from 1 to 10, we're also indicating that here precision is important. So if all the weapons had sharpness that's not decimal, but it's in increments of 10, then we wouldn't need to go from 1 to 100, right? We could go from 1 to 10. So if all swords have sharpness of 30, 40, 50, 60, and so on, then that last 0 is not really necessary, and we can cut it and have sharpness from 1 to 10. But if we consciously choose to go from 1 to 100, then we want to say that, there will come a time where two swords will be very, very close in performance, and you will have to look closely at, the specific number to see which one is better for you. So that's what the 1 to 100 system communicates. And this is great because, like we said, we don't have to explicitly say these things. Most people have a natural understanding of this from their knowledge of society. So that's the number we can use for sharpness. And by knowing where you are on this scale, you know how sharp the sword is. Next is durability, and it works in a similar way. So see how this is interesting about these two stats here going from 1 to 100. The player doesn't know exactly at this point whether one sharpness deals, for example, 1 damage. There is no indication in the system about this relationship at all. But what the player does know is how it ranks on a scale of 1 to 100. And the same goes for durability. The player doesn't know that if a sword that has, let's say, 8 durability is going to be destroyed in 8 hits or after dealing 8 hit points of damage or what. There's just no information here about that. We have to explain it somewhere else. But the player gets the same qualitative understanding that if the durability is 100, then that means that the sword is, as durable as it can be, essentially. So this is one system we can go with. An example, here's a little bonus. An example of how we could do this differently is go with, instead of calling it durability, call it something like strikes left to deliver. So if we called it strikes left to deliver and we say 7, then we are communicating through the name of the parameter exactly what it does and exactly how good it is right now. So the player knows, okay, if I only hit 7 more enemies or 7 more times, then this sword will be destroyed. So I either have to find something else in the meantime, or I will need to repair it or do something else in the game. So this is an alternative to think about. Next, we come to the type, and here, as we mentioned in our game, types are important because players can specialize in them. So of course the player will want to know the type to see if they can apply their bonuses to this particular weapon, and there can be other ones like saber or longsword or scimitar or anything else that's in the game. So it's very important to know for the player if this is one they want to use or if they can use it. And finally, for the weight, we mentioned the dual purpose, right? First is to see if it can be carried in the player's inventory, and second is how easy it will be to wield. Again, for the inventory, we have a very clear idea. If it's over the player's maximum capacity, of course, they intuitively understand that they cannot use this sword. But for the handling part, this is again interesting because we use the same trick that we do here in the parameters when we talk about weight in terms of ease of use. So again, the player doesn't know how the speed of the weapon is calculated at this point. They don't know how fast it is to swing around and so on, but they can make an intuitive decision on whether they want to upgrade to this weapon or not, simply by checking the weight and comparing it to their current sword. So if, let's say, the weight of this sword is 1, and starting from 1 kind of intuitively tells the player that this probably means 1 kilo, or whatever system the game is using, and they find a sword that weighs 2 kilos, then that sort of communicates that this will be harder to handle. So that's a cool way where we can take advantage of one stat to say 2 things about this particular weapon. Anyway, that's the quick and easy way of coming up with stats for weapons, and of course you can apply the same mindset to items, to spells in the game, to vehicles, characters, player abilities, player statistics, strength, dexterity, that sort of thing. That's how all these things are derived in an easy way. And all you need to do is ask what makes a good, and here you enter the type of thing you're making right now, to the player. So that's it for today's video. I hope this framework helps you navigate this kind of question. I know it can be kind of scary to jump into it and have to decide on the stats of something before you even see the game, before you even play the game, and hopefully this way gives you more confidence when you're designing these stats, because even though the parameters of a particular weapon might change down the line, this gives you a way to define with almost certainty what parameters you're going to need throughout the development of this particular item type. Because I said in the beginning that this is a design choice, then you can be confident that this is all you're going to use later down the line. So because these parameters are chosen by design, it's a very conscious choice that you make at the beginning of this design process. Then you know that there's going to be basically nothing later down the line that's going to surprise you and it's going to make you change this lineup, which you shouldn't have to do later down the line. And you can use this as a base to create all the subsequent items and skills and powers and so on in the game. Now, are these stats set in stone? No, of course not. They're not set in stone. But as we know in design, the more we keep changing the basis of our game, then that extends development, because it makes us have to rethink basically all other aspects of the game. So the faster we can lock this list in, the faster the rest of the design process can continue. So my approach to it would be to lock this in as early as possible at the design phase, go on and complete the rest of the design process, make all the items you need, all the characters you need, and so on for the game. And if by playing the game very extensively, you find a very, very concrete reason why either of these needs to be changed, or as it is more likely that you need one additional parameter somewhere, then if you have clear proof of what the additional parameter is, then you can consider whether you add it or not. But these should be the bedrock of your design process from there on. Anyway, that's it from me for today. I hope this is helpful for at least one other traveler out there. And as always, have fun.